I'm a licensed professional counselor in the state of Georgia. When it comes to the sex therapy, well, some of my credentials are I'm a national certified counselor. I am a certified sex therapist slash supervisor. I'm also a clinical supervisor in the state of Georgia, and I'm also a certified clinical trauma professional. So I have a few names. What else I do is I teach sex therapy. I supervise sex therapists. I teach at a university. I do speaking, all sorts of things. In my clinical focus, I work with since I'm in the middle of nowhere, you could say, in Georgia, I work with a lot of different things, but sexual trauma. I work with a lot of medical providers dealing with LGBTQIA plus issues, male sexual dysfunction issues, relationship expectation management and communication. As I said, I do a lot of clinical supervision and certifications. I have a few students and stuff on that area. And and I work with a lot of medical professionals in the area. So as I said, working a lot with sexual dysfunction issues, both male, female, cisgender, and transgender. And sometimes doctors do not like to talk about sexual behaviors. They'll talk about the genital functioning, but they don't want to talk about sex. They pass them off to me. Go talk to Mark. He'll talk to you about sex.
I have heard this. I have heard this actually. I don't know if you're familiar with Patty Britton, who started Sex Coach U.
I'm not familiar with her name, but yeah.
So she started Sex Coach U, and she told me the reason why she started that organization was actually for OBGYNs and doctors, because she said there's not a lot of actual training around sexuality for medical professionals at all. I've been told the max amount of hours you have to clock is like 3 in regards to anything having to do with sexuality. So
Yes.
they don't necessarily have any support as it is now in how to really talk about the details and the depths of someone's sexuality that is beyond, like you said, something physiological.
And actually, when I was training to be a sex therapist, my supervisor, Dr. William Talmadge, actually trained, taught at Emory University in the medical school. And when I first started in, the book he gave me was Sexual Medicine for Primary Care. I had to look at it real quick, remember the title. And that's what his first thing he said is one of the things you're going to learn is medical professionals in general, not all of them, in general, do feel very uncomfortable talking about the emotionality of sex or the sociological function of sex. If it's not something structural or organic, they sometimes feel uncomfortable, which is okay. I mean, it's not for everybody, but
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in general, as a general rule, it seems like most people feel
Yes.
uncomfortable to talk about sex.
Yes.
Why do you think that is? It's such a part of who we are.
It
Why
is.
do we keep it away with like a 10-foot stick?
A lot of it has to do with how we are brought up. I mean, I know when I grew up, the message was your genitals are dirty. Your genitals are, they were given names like it's your private space, or they would call it by any other name. Or they'll say, get your hands away from it. Don't touch it, you know? And a lot of times it was also equated to that elements, and some of it is part of our natural or body elimination process. It's sort of that other element is that urine is dirty, we don't do anything. So we get all these little messages of how bad it is. And then with that shame cycle that goes into it, and it's generational. I mean, it's been forever. And then even with faith systems, not all, but most, teach that it's not something we talk about. It's sometimes it's considered holy, sometimes it's considered, if it's not within a union, it's dirty and damnable. So we get these messages constantly. And one of the and if we're looking at anything that's not standard heteronormative heterosexual sex in the confines of some type of social construct union, it's bad. And so we're changing slowly, but it's still those underlying messages. And as we become more polarized, you're going to see a lot of those mixed messages. And a lot of people are torn. I know in my practice, people are torn about even talking to me about it. And they're coming to me specifically for that.
To talk about it. That's really interesting. So, okay, that is actually really interesting to me. I'm not surprised, but I still find it really interesting that people are paying money to come and talk to you about sex, but then when they get there, it's very hard for them to do.
Yes. Abstract, they're good. I'm having problems performing. Okay. Tell me about what that is. I have a hard time having an erection. Okay. Have you talked to your doctor? Yes, they sent me to you because they couldn't find anything wrong. Okay, well, let's talk. When you are getting ready to have sex, tell me how you're feeling. Normal, I guess. Normal. Well, what's normal? What's normal for you? What's that like? So yeah, it's, and then when we talk about specific issues, sometimes it's like if I'm doing couples, or even I deal with also non-standard relationships, like non-consensual, non-monogamy, consensual non-monogamy, polyamory. So sometimes when I work with those groups as well, and we bring in the other partners, so or the metamors to that, which is the partner's partner kind of deal. Sometimes it's just like, okay, I can't talk about it now. That person I'm having sex with is right here, and I can't talk about that. So yeah, there's just a lot of mixed messages. And I think a lot of those mixed messages sometimes comes from digital media as well, based on who they watch, what they watch, and stuff like that. And so that can be very confusing, depending on what interest or what feeds or what else goes on in there.
You mentioned at the start of our call a list of actually many things that you do. I'm curious if there's one thing in particular that you enjoy the most.
I like it all. I do like supervising. That's the big thing. But when it comes to actually working with clients, I would say probably the biggest thing is expectations management and communication in work, in sexual communication and expectations. Because a lot of times, since people have a hard time communicating, even partner to partner, they don't understand what the expectations is, not only in the relationship, but when it comes to sex. And one theme I see a lot is, and it happens to both males and females, even non-binary, transgender, it can happen as we get older, sex actually changes. We go from more of that hot, bothered, really physically drawn sex to more emotional type sex, more emotional connection and stuff like that. And so if you don't communicate about it when you get to it, one of the common complaints I will get with it's typically more in a heteronormative couples where and this happens a lot in my practice. I can't speak for all, but in my practice, I'll have the male, the husband, say, I want to be wanted. And a lot of times she doesn't act like she wants me. And when we go through it, there is, but their communication's off. And what that looks like is off. I call it the flannel pajama thing, because the reason is, in this one story I tell, he's sitting on the couch watching TV. She walks in her flannel pajamas, looks at him, and says, "What you going?" He goes, "I'm finished watching this program." And she goes, "When are you coming to bed?" Well, this program will end in probably about 25 minutes. And she stares at him for a minute and walks off. Next morning, she's throwing things around. "What's wrong with you?" "I wanted sex last night." "No, you didn't. You came in with flannel pajamas. How's that sexy?" And so then they started calling it, every time she wore her sexy flannels. So he knew when she wore those flannels that she was interested.
Now, is this a real story of a client?
It's a real story, not of a client, of some friends I know. It's a real story. Yes.
Oh, that is hilarious.
So, but their expectations weren't the same, and they didn't have that communication. And so that's one of the things I like the most, is when we can go, okay, our language, our expectations this is what's coming through, and reconnecting on what sex is supposed to be like for them and for that couple or that individual or whoever. I think that's what I enjoy the most. And then I would say the next would be actual working with somebody where we work in tandem, because I was trained when I was being trained as a therapist. I was trained in a treatment team modality mindset, where you work with other professionals and you build that history and that story, because we are more than just a one-dimensional thing. We have the emotionality, we have the physicality, the intellectual element, social element. We're more than just the physical. So I kind of like it all.
Fascinating. And I really like a few things that you said. Just to what you left with, I love that you mentioned, we are multidimensional beings. And that is so true. And I think sometimes when people aren't healing in any area, it could be sexuality, but it could be something different too. Sometimes it's because there are other aspects that need to be addressed. Like you said, there's the emotional, there's the physical, there's the intellectual, the social, there's so many aspects of us. And it's interesting too. I like how you brought up how important communication is between partners, because that is one of the reasons, obviously we're from Live Jasmine, and I've interviewed several members and models, I mean, hundreds at this point, actually. And I've interviewed members who have had a relationship with the same model for 15 years, 20 years. And I talk about it a lot because it really fascinates me. But when I think about what about this dynamic where these two people online connected in a way that they now talk still at least once a week for 15 years, I think it's the explicit communication. I need this, because that member has to be very clear in his or her or their needs to get those needs met. And I think when you find someone that you have deemed safe to communicate such vulnerable aspects of yourself, you bond to them deeply. And I'm like, okay, I really think that communication that you just said, that really clear communication, I want this, I need this, do this, that can really bond people. And you're much closer that way to having your needs and wants met.
And if we look at sex as it is from a physiological standpoint, sex is one of the most vulnerable things we can do. If we look at it if from a biological function element, even like if you look at animals in the wild, they're constantly looking around because they are both incredibly vulnerable in those moments. And we are still that way. We are very emotionally vulnerable, physically vulnerable. And that is sometimes where because I have worked with adult performers. I have worked with both in practice and when I talk or I would go to a conference or something where we have them. And I have a few friends who do work in those elements. And the thing is, when you're going through these elements, you have to be very, very cautious that of how you want to develop that relationship, because for a lot of them, it's transactional. But for the person on the other side, it's non-transactional.
Sometimes actually, I have heard from models that members will become too about the transaction, like, I'm paying you, you do this now. And the model's like, okay, wait, no, I'm actually still a human being. You know what I mean? Sometimes I think they can see it as maybe too transactional, and I'm sure there's vice versa where it's tricky. It is interesting when money is involved and there's a transaction. One thing that I personally like about it is that you have to work harder to misinterpret the relationship because you're paying for something, right? But then I like what I think you're pointing to is that because this vulnerable area gets shared, it does open up a door to just want to misinterpret the relationship, maybe.
Yes, especially if they have problems communicating outside of these set type environments.
Right.
Some people are very socially awkward. And so that's where it can kind of be a double-edged sword is, yes, some of them are in that transactional element and that's it. And it's just, that's what it is. But then some can get overly into the emotional environment. And when we look at orgasm, one of the hormones that's released is oxytocin, which is a pair bonding hormone. We call it the love hormone. And whatever we're looking at or touching, we bond to.
I actually want to go back to something you said earlier that I found really interesting, which is that the younger we are, the more hot and heavy we experience and see sexuality. And as we age, we actually experience it in a more emotional way.
Right.
Can you explain to me why that is, or what it is?
So as we age and as we develop, it becomes, so if we look at the primary function of what sex is, which is procreation, okay, then when we're younger and we have the resources and we're able, I mean, human beings dedicate a tremendous amount of energy to their offspring. And our offspring is one of the most fragile in the first year of its life, or first until it starts developing. So we dedicate so much resources. So, and then when we're younger, we also have our fertility element is more at the beginning. So yes, we are a lot more hot and heavy and hands-on and everything earlier because it increases our risk of our chances and our risk of procreating. And so as we do that, and as we age, we have less energy to dedicate too young. However, it doesn't mean that the secondary element for sex for humans is social and relationship building. So it's still present. So then what it changes is we don't need to focus on, a lot of times we've already raised our families and everything else, but we still want to maintain that connection. And so it moves in to those elements. And so when we are engaging, it's less about the physicality and more about the connection. Yes, we still want the orgasm, we still want that other thing, but a lot of times our bodies aren't going to move in all the other directions that we did when we were 20 or 30, when we're 40, 50, 60, 70, even 80. I remember when I was an intern, they say craft mat adjustable beds are the best creation for sex in our twilight years. So yeah, so that's why it changes. And we can also go from the type of relationship can change also to become more companion based. For some individuals or couples, sex is no longer part of it, but they still have everything else. That's how sex naturally changes for us.
Very interesting. It's very interesting because I'm thinking about what you just described in terms of even Live Jasmine. And, you know, a lot of these relationships are more like a digital companionship.
Yes.
It's never true intercourse. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's heavy on fantasy, really.
And sometimes with a few of the people I've worked with who are in that type of in this industry, they do report some of their more long-term clients just want the interaction. They don't want the sex piece. It's just communication.
I can't tell you how many members and models I've interviewed where the member has told me, oh, I've been seeing this model for 17 years. To this day, I've never seen her without her shirt on. To this day, I've never seen her nude. Oh, well, what do you guys talk about? Well, I started talking to her when I had lost my mother, and then we developed a friendship. And then now she, you know, she gives me advice and she listens to me. And literally, it just is this online friendship. It
Yes.
used to shock me. It used to, but now I've heard it from so many members and models who will be like, yeah, some members come in and they will actually say, okay, set up your camera and just live your life.
Yep.
And I said, well, what do you think that's about? And, you know, models will tell me, well, they just want to feel like they're living life with someone. Like, okay, I'm doing the dishes, you know, if you had someone and now I'm at my computer, and they just want that feeling of just being around. Never do they ask about or talk about anything sexual. It
Yes.
is fascinating to me, but I've heard it so much at this point that and to be fair, you know, the Kinsey Institute has done a lot of research on Live Jasmine and has said that what they found is that the calls that lasted the longest and the models who were generating the largest amount of income, most of the time, were not talking about anything explicit.
Correct.
Just fascinating to me.
They want that general intimacy that they are missing or unable to get for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And depending on the environment and everything, it's interesting to see how some relationships are based on just needing to feel connected. And as we become a global society, it's even more so that way. Just because of interests. And yeah, we're losing elements of small community connection, which means a lot of times we are not engaging in those not only general intimacy, but even superficial intimacy that we experience just as walking in through and just having, I don't know if you've ever had this experience where if you're standing in line at the grocery store and all of a sudden you just start chatting to the person behind you for 5 minutes and then that's it.
Love that.
We're most people now are like, where's my phone? They're in line, they're doing this. And so if we're looking at, even with these types of resources, just general intimacy and connection, that's another, you're right. Most of the people that I know that work in the industry, they do make the most money out of any stuff that has nothing to do with any type of explicit activity.
You know, I interviewed a member just a couple of days ago, and he's been a member of Jasmine for 14 years. And I asked him, what's kept you on the site for so long? And he said, the friendship.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, oh, it wasn't anything, any of that flirty content. And he said, well, that got me in the door, but that's not what kept me for 14 years. You know what I mean? Like, and keep in mind, this is it you pay. You know what I mean? This is you're paying for this in some cases by the minute, and you're engaging in this for 14 years. And yeah, he said, no, I thought I went there for the sexual content, but that's not what I stayed for. And that's not what I was really there for. It's really interesting.
That connection piece, that when you deal with those people who are really strong, high profile work, and they spend all their time just dedicated to their careers and stuff, and they don't have time for that connection. And then when they come home, they're so tired that they don't want to go out. And that's when you're going to see some of those people. A lot of them, I mean, even when I'm dealing with individuals who are trying to connect, I'm thinking of a couple people already that they dedicated so much of their lives to their careers that now that they are stable and rock solid and have entered that transition where they haven't been able, that they have the time, they've lost the skills to do that. So they need something that's less formal or less spontaneous. They need that. And sometimes going online, it is a lot easier for it because the expectation is there. I'm coming on here for this. I know and this is where I'm connecting, and this is what I'm doing. So a lot of that stuff that we normally do when we are in social situations, whether that's with our friends or family or in the general public, that doesn't, we don't have to set those things up, or even worse, in their minds, constant rejection. I don't have to worry about being rejected because I'm going onto this platform, I'm paying for it, so they're going to accept me coming in. And then as I find someone I connect with, then I can open up this more intimate dialogue with them. And I don't have to sacrifice anything else that I've been working hard for. I can control the level of intimacy. So sometimes that's the other thing. They've been hurt and they don't want to risk. And sometimes it's not a risk for them. Or if it is, they can ghost. They can just turn it off and go.
Absolutely. There is a safety net, which is called exit out, click. You know what I mean?
Yep. Yep. They can just leave. So yeah, there's that.
I'm curious, in your experience as a therapist, is there anything that's been recurrent as an issue or a block to a sexually fulfilled life in your clients?
So I'm going to sound like a broken record, but when it comes to what I work on, when it comes to sex and just intimacy, it's expectations and communication. The other piece that it's been in the background that is the consent. And sometimes the consent element when we're looking at sex or we're looking at intimacy, sometimes the consent element gets mixed up because of the communication or the expectations. And as we get older, one of the things that gets happen, and this goes back to, typically in the 40 somethings, I see it a lot, is I'm not sure what I'm allowed to do and what I'm not allowed to do anymore. When we were in our 20s, we were just hot and heavy, and whatever I did was good. Now I do this and I get snapped at, or if I don't do this, I get this evil eye, or I don't know what's expected of me. And sometimes it's when you're dealing with children, parents who have kids in that more needy but less needy age. So usually between like 7 and 13, where they are able to do a lot of their own things, but they still need that mom, dad to do whatever. That communication naturally gets lost. And then it's, am I even allowed to touch you here? Or even, am I allowed to even talk to you about this subject? And am I even allowed to discuss what I'm wanting or needing anymore? That's the other thing is I get this message, I'm not allowed to say what I need. We've been together for so long that he or she should already know what I want. That's another one I give a lot, is safer sex talks. You can't get much, and that's why a lot of people also go online. You can't get much safer than sometimes many, many, many miles away from the individual. You can't get much safer than that. So, yeah.
Yeah,
So there's a lot of different reasons. Yeah.
If you could give one message to everyone in the world about human sexuality that you don't think we're quite getting just yet, what would that message be?
Oh man, I say the primary message is honest communication and expectations management. That's the biggest thing, is you need to be honest with yourself first, and then honest with your partner, and balance expectations, and don't immediately assume that what you're asking for or wanting to explore is necessarily going to be rejected. Being rejected is hard. I don't know any. Well, there are some people out there who get a thrill being rejected, but the vast majority of us don't want to be rejected. So, and that's where kind of being honest with yourself comes in. Trying to think, is there anything? Yeah, the biggest thing I would say is communication and expectations. And the only thing I would say that really tops them is consent. Consent's a huge piece. I don't think people are allowed to give themselves consent anymore. They need to give themselves consent to be able to say, and they need to be able to definitely have consent for their partners in consideration. So
your messaging is consistent. I like it. That has been your major message, I think, throughout the interview.
Yeah.
My final question to you is, what are our next steps and your perspective to create a more sexually well and positive society?
So for sex positivity, I know it's gonna sound counterintuitive, but we should not focus on sex. We should focus on intimacy, because it's the intimacy and the communication that is the forefront of how anything is constructed. And those will naturally lead to more positive sex. We have to be willing to talk and follow back into that consensual and expectations elements. And the only way we're going to know what the expectations are is communication. And the only way we're going to get there is by creating this intimate bond that is not always sexually motivated or based. Intimacy can exist in any type of relationship. It doesn't have to be sexual intimacy.
I've really enjoyed this interview. Thank you so much, Mark.
You, no problem. Bye.